Okay, so we're back for the second half. Um, Ed, you had a question that was posed by a Platypus member about your article in Compact. What
That's
was it?
right. Right. So actually, between our the conversation that we just recorded and this one, I happened to receive an email from a Platypus member regarding my article in Compact, and he asked me, and I thought I would pass the question on to you as fodder for our discussion here. Um, what was it that made the Democratic Party specifically and the establishment in general so sclerotic politically post 2001, post recession, right? If the arc of our prior conversation is that in prior periods in the history of capitalism, the past century, the Democratic Party proved relatively flexible in terms of facilitating the reformulation of Fordism, and then later on the Great Society, and even you could say in the face of Reaganism and neoliberalism, um, you see a flexibility in the Democratic Party and in the establishment generally. And that flexibility appears to have been missing in the age of Trump. So how do you account for that? And I have just one addition. This isn't an answer, but it's just something that this question from our fellow Platypus member brought to mind. I've had sitting unread on my shelf for some years now a book by Chris Hedges, who I don't follow closely,
Right.
titled "The Death of the Liberal Class,"
Hmm.
and um, and so actually, after receiving this question, it's been a few hours between our last conversation and this one. The audience might not know. I listened to Chris Hedges' book talk
Hmm.
and about that book, and he gave it in 2010.
Hmm.
And he said that the book began as a research project into the crisis of journalism as an institution, sort of asking what happened to the liberal class formerly at the helm of the journalistic institutions of society. And as he researched and explored that question, it led him to diagnose a crisis across institutions of society, that this once sort of regnant liberal class had actually sort of fallen from dominance, not only in journalism, but also in churches, in labor, in universities, sort of across institutions. And ultimately, the way that he characterized the function of that liberal class is to serve as a mechanism for reform.
Yeah.
That there was a sort of liberal class, establishmentarian class, that served this reform function, and that had ceased. And he actually at one point analogizes it to a situation that Dostoevsky diagnosed in the late 19th and early 20th century
Hmm.
in the context of a sclerotic Russian aristocracy
Hmm.
that soon would be overthrown by revolution, which of course brings to mind this isn't a connection, of course, that Hedges draws, but it brings to mind the Adam Curtis hypernormalization formulation from a different era, the sclerosis of the later Soviet bureaucracy itself. So putting all of that out there, there's a lot that we could say about Hedges, but it brought to mind Hedges' basic thesis. And I don't know that, I think Hedges is anti-Reaganite, anti-Clintonite. He sort of pins it on the corporatization of American politics of the Democratic Party. So that's one form of explanation. I think he looks at campaign finance changes under Clinton specifically, and that could be expected from Hedges given his politics, right? So I want to put the question to you as it stands, and I just want to sort of raise that as like from a different political quarter and actually earlier, someone who's perhaps presciently trying to grapple with or raising a similar problem.
Right. So I would say that the sclerosis is something that's affecting not just the Democratic Party. And I also think that the sort of obvious point is that Trump was only able to kind of take over, have a hostile takeover of the Republican Party, because in some ways the Republican Party was even worse than the Democratic Party as far as this kind of impasse is concerned. So first of all, like death of the liberal class, that sounds like wishful thinking. It's also a kind of complaint, meaning, you wish that they were alive. And in terms of the sclerosis of the Democratic Party, we have to be careful. So thinking about like my lifetime, and also people will say this about Trump, he's a kind of once in a 50-year cycle type figure. So he might be even more significant. Like a lot of people in the Republican sympathetic to Trump orbit um, are saying that it's quite possible that Trump is more consequential than Reagan. Will prove to be more consequential than Reagan. So he is a kind of combination of Nixon and Reagan, and maybe even more consequential.
And,
So
and,
that
and if I could just say, incidentally, Hedges says the last liberal class president was Nixon.
was Nixon, right? And so he has a view that I was going to say this the so-called liberal class, especially in the realm of journalism, is the sort of high Fordist liberal class,
Right,
right?
right.
It's Walter Cronkite, it's whatever, right? And so it would seem that the neoliberal era is the end of that political class, ruling class, whatever you want to call it, and is replaced by something else. And what it seems replaced by seems much lesser in its capacities. And again, not just in the journalistic sphere. So, what occurred to me was like Chris Hedges as a kind of Chomskyan type, and manufacturing consent. And manufacturing consent, the Chomsky idea, is really based on that Fordist era.
Hmm.
And so since then, it's like since the passing of that era, we haven't even had manufacturing consent the way that Chomsky diagnosed it, because he was really thinking about like, you know, um, like the consensus that was glued together by these much more apparently independent institutions, right? So it would appear that the media was more independent of the state in the Vietnam era than it is now, actually. Right. So that's what we're also talking about. We're talking about a kind of collapsing of, institutional differences. So, and also when I hear like, corporations and this kind of thing, like this kind of petty bourgeois, populistic kind of discontent and kind of progressivistic, like you need the state to fight the corporations. And of course, the
Yes.
corporations are civil society, meaning the fact that they are separate from the state, because they are, means that they can do things like we were talking about in the first half. The oligarchs, the tech venture capital, Silicon Valley, they switch sides. They're free to do
Mhm.
that, in fact. And it doesn't matter if they were patronized by one party or another, if they were subsidized through policies favored by one party or another. Like Elon Musk was subsidized by like green energy initiatives under, Obama and Biden. It doesn't matter. Like that doesn't buy any loyalty either way, right? So, I'm just allergic to a lot of these formulations from my lifetime. So when I'm thinking of my lifetime, born in 1970, so my lifetime is the period of Nixon, Reagan, etc. And in that period, and I always warn people about this, that it can look like the ruling party is the Republican Party. Because after all, Nixon served one term, started serving a second term, Ford finished out his term, Carter was one term. Then there was 12 years of Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush. Then 8 years of Obama, but 8 years of George W. Bush. And 8 years of Obama, but 4 years of Trump, 4 years of Biden, and now 4 years of Trump. So looked at from the standpoint of 2025, it looks like the Republicans are doing pretty well in terms of the presidency. And also for a significant amount of this time now, since 1994, the Republicans have had majorities in Congress in a way that they had not previously. So it looks like what we were talking about in the first half, the Republicans are, poised to potentially become the majority party and to cast the Democrats into a permanent minority status. And then people wonder about the Constitution and how it's skewed in such a way, the Electoral College and the Senate, to benefit um, the Republicans at the expense of the Democrats. So what we're really talking about is, all sorts of assumptions about, the problem is the Democratic Party. And I think I kind of warned you about this in our previous conversation about your article, that acknowledging that the problem is the Democratic Party and what's going to be consequential about Trump is his effect on the Democratic Party, we still can't just look at the Democratic Party. We have to look at the bipartisan consensus and how it changes. Now, why I bring that up is that there are many actors, right? So there's like the corporate sector, there's academia, there's journalism, there's the media, there's all that stuff. There is the state, there's the state bureaucracy. Then there are these parties. There are elected officials, there are unelected bureaucrats. These have different tempos of change, and they are separate institutions. So when we're looking at the bureaucracy, we're looking at a kind of artifact of a kind of lagging prior bipartisan consensus.
Right.
So generally speaking, the bureaucracy doesn't belong to one party or another. So why does it seem like it belongs to the Democratic Party? Because it belongs to the prior bipartisan consensus that Trump is breaking with.
Neoliberal.
Yeah. Neoliberal and post-neoliberal. And so, he's prosecuting, James Comey, who's a Republican. He's going to prosecute John Bolton, a Republican. So, the kind of high-profile prosecutions are not, in fact, Democrats.
Right.
Right. So, and in both cases, they would seem to represent the permanent bureaucracy, deep state, professional kind of state officials rather than politicians. John Bolton is kind of like a think tank, conservative neocon foreign policy guy, but still part of the same kind of the blob, the foreign policy blob, the State Department and national security apparatus, bipartisan consensus. So I think that in that respect, what we're talking about is what we talked about last time, how they agree to disagree, what's the basis on which the parties disagree, and that the bureaucracy is really based on that. In other words, it's based on what they agree on, bipartisan consensus. It's also based on how they agree to disagree, meaning there are different elements, there are different individuals in the deep state who are more Republican leaning or Democratic Party leaning or leaning in this policy direction or that policy direction. So when we're talking about like the sclerosis of the parties, I think that we only see that. We can't just say, oh, the Democrats lost an election, they must be sclerotic. I think it's more accurate to say Donald Trump was able to swoop in and get the nomination. That's the indication of a sclerotic party. Meaning that the party itself can't really choose its candidate. Because if the party itself had had its choice, it would not have chosen Trump. Definitely not. Right. And he won a lot of primaries on the basis of independent voters.
So that implies to me, though, the opposite, actually, that the Republican Party was not sclerotic, like the fact that a kind of post-neoliberal
You mean that it could be renewed? But the question is, how much was it? And it certainly wasn't in the first term. Meaning,
right.
like, who's a rhino, right? So Republican in name only. But wait a second. These are like test tube baby Republicans. They're not Republican in name only. Like your Paul Ryans and these kinds of people who rejected Trump, Mitt Romney. Like these are your fully born to be a Republican, like not Republican in name only. So you're saying that the true blue Republican Party is in name only, and then Trump is the real Republican? No. So it's like, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, it's not about the ability of the Republican Party to be renewed. It's the hollow shell that was taken over. Right? That's really the issue. And that the Democrats
if I follow you, that it had come to that it had come to Trump is the sign of the sclerosis, right?
That's what it is.
So you would say then, in that sense,
meaning the Democrats were able to stop Bernie, which means that they're viable.
But would you sort of accept the premise of the question that there is like a historically greater degree of sclerosis now than in the past 100 years, say?
I think that what you're talking about there is like flexibility as to policy. And that's different from agility as to election. Like, in
Mm,
other words,
mm.
can they shift electorally to be competitive and win? That's electoral agility. That's different from suppleness, flexibility of policy. It's very different. Those are different criteria. So I
Mhm.
think that we have to separate out the policy impasse and inertia from the electoral agility,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
especially because, and that's where Trump, what we were talking about in the first half today, Trump is this curious figure because his electoral agility is supposed to be in the service of basically a standard policy,
Right.
right?
Right.
It's supposed to be a tweak, meaning,
Immigration reform, aligning international trade with the already existing patterns of national repatriation of capital. Right.
right. And also just like China versus Russia and this kind of thing, like everyone agrees the US needs to play China against Russia and Russia against China. Everybody agrees, right? And
Hmm.
yet, right, also everybody agrees Russia needs to be stopped, right? And does Trump disagree with any of that? No, right? So Trump thinks the Ukraine war has to be stopped and Russia has to be stopped. In other words, Russia can't like win. And indeed, Russia has already lost. Like that's Trump's whole point is to say Russia's already lost, meaning he has to say two things at once. He has to say the Biden policy is an abject failure, and yet the Biden policy was successful. It stopped Russia from winning, which Trump would
Right. And
also consider an unacceptable outcome,
the fact that they
right?
had to undertake the invasion in the first place as a
They
symptom of
had to
weakness.
do the invasion, but that they had to carry on. But they had to
Mm,
carry on, right? Because you could say, like I think that Trump actually believes that he could have prevented the war by negotiating with Russia in good faith rather than refusing to negotiate, which is what Biden seemed to do. Right? And this is why it looks like fecklessness. And so, again, it's management problems, like how to manage these things. And also it's like tactical, like when are you hard on Russia? When are you soft on Russia? Because I think Biden infamously said, "Oh, it's just going to be a short skirmish." And in saying that, he seemed to invite the Russian invasion. Like, "Oh, we don't take it too seriously." And that seemed to sort of invite it. Whereas maybe at that point he should have been really hard on Russia before the invasion,
mm,
as opposed to after the invasion when they got very hard on Russia.
mm,
And
mm.
so Trump looks at that and he's just like, these people don't know what they're doing. But what's the goal? The goal is to prevent Russia from taking over Ukraine, and the goal is to end the war as quickly as possible, right? Which, again, he just thinks that they just handled it tactically wrong. That's not a difference in principle. It's not like, oh, Tucker
Right.
Carlson has to go over and talk to Vladimir Putin and hear his Duganite nonsense about thousands of years of history and be like, oh, yeah, that's a point. Like that's just not required. It's not like, oh, to be a Trumpist, you have to sort of like drink the Kool-Aid, which means you have to see Putin as not so bad. And actually, once you see Putin as not so bad, oh, it turns out Hitler's not so bad. Turns out
Right.
like Winston Churchill is the bad guy of World War II. What the fuck are they doing? Like, you know what I mean? In other words, that just proves the point that the Republican Party is still a mess,
Yeah.
meaning
Yeah. Yeah.
they're not able to be solidly behind Trump. They have to
Uh-huh.
do these kind of weird ad hoc ex post facto rationalizations that don't hold up, and they get carried away. Now, the Democrats do that too. They do. Meaning, like, what is the goal of the policy? Like, was the Biden policy to open the border and let in millions of people? Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't.
Hmm.
Maybe he just meant to undo the Trump draconian border policies, but did not intend to have the border be flooded. But once it was flooded, his hands were tied because the only option was to go back to the Trump policies, which he didn't want to do.
Right. Right.
Right? In other words, it could be incompetence. But then
Uh,
you have to treat it like intentional. You have to hold them responsible, right? and say, but didn't you intend this? And weren't you saying this? No person is illegal. And isn't this the outcome of that attitude? So the mixture of rhetoric and tactic and principle is very difficult to parse. So I think that what's fallen apart is their ability to line those things up effectively. And also policy inertia. So I'd say that the sclerosis diagnosis is really about, it's not about losing elections. It's about policy inertia. Meaning, can they think outside the box? Can they take a fresh look at things? Or is it this tunnel vision of this bipartisan consensus that afflicts American policy, right? So it's not, political sclerosis, it's a little tricky because as it turns out, maybe not so much, meaning, you got the squad, you got Zoran Mamdani, you got Trump, obviously, you got the Trumpians, you got your MAGA people, you have people who are old style Republicans who are converting. You have your Ted Cruz and your Marco Rubio getting on board, right?
Yes.
And learning the ropes, right? And what are they learning? They're learning how you do the rhetoric and the policy, how you line those up, how you handle that, right? Because I think that the paranoia afflicting American politics is that people knew that the rhetoric and the reality and the policy didn't line up. Like they just knew, I'm being told something. And we had various phases of that. We had the war on terror, we had the Great Recession, we had COVID. We had healthcare reform, ACA, Obamacare. We had the Ukraine war.
Immigration reform that never happened.
Immigration reform that never happened. And so it was unclear, like, Trump was building a wall and he was much more draconian, but he was deporting less people than Obama. Right? And then Biden, again, we talked about that. Was this intended or not?
Right.
And so that kind of like policy inertia and the sense that maybe we need different alternatives, different alternative policies, different electoral competition formulations of policy, which also means a different bipartisan consensus. Right. And that's like the Ezra Klein thing. Right. And again, the difficulty with dealing with like Ezra Klein or Van Jones is that are these policy guys or are they rhetoric guys? Are they messaging guys? And what's the difference? In other words, you run, like I think Ezra Klein is saying, I would like to see the Democratic Party run anti-abortion candidates in red states.
Yes.
Is he advocating like banning abortion or implementing laws against abortion? No, he's not. He's saying where it's already illegal. You ought to compete in those states by running candidates who have to go along with the fact that abortion's already illegal in those states. And to get elected, they have to say that they'll respect the fact that abortion is illegal in that state.
The new status quo, essentially.
Yeah, the new status quo. And so, and of course, then the question is like, oh, but wait, that's rhetoric. And I think Ezra Klein says specifically, you have to run more conservative in order to be elected so that you can be more progressive in office.
Yes.
Why is that getting so much pushback? Because it's getting a lot of pushback.
Right.
Why? And I think it's because there's a sense that this is like giving away the game. This is sort of exposing the hollowness of it all. That that maybe it isn't a matter of these grand principles that people imagine it to be, and that if you do that, you might disenchant the electorate too much. In other words, you might lead the electorate to think that, oh, we're not like agile and savvy, and flexible, and willing to make compromises. You might just expose the whole thing as more or less fraudulent. Meaning like, what does the Democratic Party stand for? Right. And also in the age, I think that part of the interpretation of the last couple of elections is that Obama was the last candidate to be able to run where he could say different things to different audiences.
Yeah, right,
In the
right.
age of the internet, the idea now is that everything is out there, and so they can't code switch and modulate, right?
Hmm.
They're going to be held to things that they say to different audiences, and that's going to make them look dishonest,
Right,
two-faced,
inconsistent.
right? And so I think that, you know, that's what they're struggling with now. But I also think, is there a policy? Now, notice what Trump has offered in the election of 2024. So after Roe v. Wade was struck down, he kind of let slip that he kind of wished that that hadn't happened because he thought it benefited the Democrats too much, and he was afraid it
Mm,
would cost him the
yes.
election in 2024.
Yeah.
Right. And so it was kind of like, well, I appointed anti-abortion Supreme Court justices, but I didn't mean them to do this.
Right.
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 But then, he said, well, I've always stood for the fact that people should be able to have different positions on this.
Hmm.
Right. And, I'm against a nationwide, ban on abortion. And, and maybe we can come to some kind of general compromise like they have in Europe of 15 weeks and making exceptions for rape and incest. Right? Like he was trying to drive some, and we went to the RNC and people thought that this was selling out on abortion.
Right. With the Sublation film crew, we sort of filmed when the party had actually, I think, taken categorical opposition to abortion
Nationwide ban,
out of its, yeah, taken a nationwide ban out of its platform, and the evangelical anti-abortion activists were incensed and protesting at the RNC.
freaking out.
That was arguably the real protest at the RNC.
That
Um,
was.
because along with that, they redefined, they took out the definition of marriage as between a man and a woman
That's
from the
right.
Republican Party platform.
That's right. And
Yeah.
this is selling out to the devil. And, whereas obviously, uh, so in other words, the competition between the two parties is abortion legal or illegal, but how many weeks
Right.
and with what exceptions,
Right.
right? And what else is included? Is fertility treatment, does that fall under some kind of ban on embryonic like research? And, what's the definition of a life? Are frozen embryos considered lives because a certain number of them have to be aborted, right? So when they do that, when they do artificial um, fertilization and implantation, they have to do more than they actually end up being given birth to. So you can't have that technology without abortion being part of it.
Right. Right.
Right. And does that mean that you're banning fertility treatment? And instead, no, right? He actually adopted specific rhetoric. He said, she's the abortion queen and I'm the fertility king about Kamala Harris. Do you remember that?
No.
Meaning, of course, men want to fertilize as much as possible, and of course, women are all secretly horrible, matriarchal, infanticide people.
Mm-hmm.
They're all, you know, um,
Yeah. Yeah.
Cersei,
Yeah.
um,
Sure.
killing their children. And so
Yeah.
Kamala is the abortion queen and I'm the fertility king,
Uh-huh.
right? And that, again, like I'm against abortion, but not to the extent that I'm going to get in the way of people having fertility treatments,
Right. Right.
right? And you could say, okay, well, that creates this other thing, natalism versus antinatalism or something, because
Mhm.
that's where that natalism idea comes from, is that maybe natalism is, well, ultimately we want more births and we're willing to countenance some abortions in order to get more births. So it's
Interesting.
it's no longer pro and anti-abortion. It's more
Yeah.
pro anti-natalism.
Fascinating. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
course, the Democrats are not just like pro-abortion, but they're anti-natal because climate change.
Oh, sure. Right.
AOC said having children is selfish.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's your progressive.
Yeah.
She's never taken that back.
Yeah.
Never taken that back. So you see how the issues are subtly shifting.
Yes.
They're subtly shifting. It's not the old way that they agreed to disagree.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not the old game, and even the policies are shifting, right? So it's not just position and rhetoric. It's not. It's how we even define reproductive health, right? Remember that was the big Democratic Party thing on abortion, is that they weren't like pro-abortion, they were pro-women's reproductive health.
Mm. Hmm.
And then, of course, the Republicans were there to say, well, maybe abortion is actually bad for women's reproductive health.
Hmm.
Because look at all these things. Like, often women get abortions and then they can't have children after that. Right? Is this really reproductive freedom? How are we defining reproductive freedom? These things are going to change. It's not going to be the old debate anymore. It just isn't.
Yeah.
It's already no
Yeah.
longer the old debate.
Right. I think I see what you're saying. So to return to the original question, the apparent sclerosis, you noted that that
The
could be.
Democrats are in a conservative the Democrats are in a conservative position, meaning they're afraid of giving up any part of their electoral coalition, especially because it seems already weak. So if your electoral coalition is already soft, it's already weak, then of course you can't afford to give up any element of it, can you?
Right.
Right? You can't like risk it. And Ezra Klein is like, we have to risk it. He calls it risking politics. We have to risk being political,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And I think that we talked about this about the Gavin Newsom Charlie Kirk discussion on Gavin Newsom's podcast, where a key moment for me that I pointed out to you was when Charlie Kirk said, "Well, you're bound to take that position.
Yes.
You're
Yes.
bound to represent the opposite side of the debate." And that's what a
Hmm.
lot of this is. But then we might lose sight of the fact that the debate has suddenly shifted,
Right. Right.
right? The debate itself has suddenly shifted such that taking the other side of the debate is no longer what it used to be.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I see. And this is the whole notion of neoliberal to post-neoliberal realignment, that the center changes, meaning that what's precisely up for debate changes. So right. If I could try to summarize, and you can jump in and correct me, but the appearance of sclerosis, you noted that that can be divided then politically, electorally on the one hand, and policy on the other. And politically, electorally, you could say that even though there may have appeared, there may appear to have been sclerosis, Trump was clearly able to take over one of the two major parties, and eventually the Democrats, Ezra Klein, are coming around to the notion of acting more politically, being willing to lose some of their existing coalition to perhaps gain other parts. But also, even at the level of policy, which would seem more
Yes.
sclerotic, um, it's it's not
Trump's
as
more flexible. Like
Trump's more flexible.
that's
But
why
but
in the 2016 primaries, but then also Obama's response to Trump in the election and after, they all said Trump doesn't stand for anything. He only stands for himself,
mm, mhm, mhm.
right? They
but
didn't even say he flip-flopped on the issues. They
but
just said he
just
didn't stand for anything. And that's why, because he was in fact not fitting their framework of what standing
right.
for something means.
Right, as we discussed, he stands for negotiation itself. He stands for putting to rest the old conflicts to shift the terrain onto new ground. So that's the way in which the system, if you will, has ultimately proven not fatally sclerotic as well at the level of
Right.
policy. That actually the terrain of the old debates has now shifted, and there are new debates.
And you need new politicians who are willing to do that. You can't
Yeah.
have these 80-year-olds who just are repeating themselves, mumbling themselves to sleep, which is what the two
Hmm.
parties were. So I saw
Right.
Glenn Lowry, and he has waxed hot and cold vis-a-vis Trump. Like, he in some ways doesn't like Trump, like
Yeah.
fundamentally. But then he said the problem with the Democrats is that they won't just let him be president. Why can't
Right.
you just let him be president? He won the
Yeah.
election. You just let him be president. Like, why not?
This
Right?
was in a way the subtext of my piece in Compact.
And so don't normalize Trump, and
Right.
oh no, it's the end of democracy if he's reelected in 2020 and then in 2024, but then it's not the end of democracy. and he makes all these threats, but ultimately, he abides by the law in the Supreme Court. He doesn't do anything outside the law. Like the part of the problem we're dealing with the Battle of Chicago here,
Mm.
and ICE is here, the FBI are here, and the National Guard might be here soon. And the really frustrating thing with respect to Pritzker and Brandon Johnson and all the Democratic Party commentary is that at the end of the day, Trump is not doing anything illegal.
Right, of course.
In other words, he's simply exercising the legal authority that he has, but they have to characterize it as fascism. Like they are really going to town on the rhetoric. They really
Yeah,
are, you
yeah,
know? But it's just that. It's just rhetoric.
right.
And also on the Trump side of it, it's theater. It is theater too, right? It's they need to be seen doing something and
Yeah,
fulfilling the mandate. And maybe he didn't even want to fulfill the mandate, but maybe he has to. Maybe he felt like I was elected to do this, so I have to do it,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And so, but again, everything seems like a violation of high principle, but in fact, it might just be much more mundane,
mm.
which is that he's trying to scare people into, self-deporting and scare people into not even crossing the border to begin with,
Right.
and, send a message, and that's more important than actually deporting millions of people,
Yeah, yeah,
because I think that what they've said is that they're proud to say that you know, they've deported 600,000 people, but the bigger accomplishment is that more than 2 million have self-deported,
right, right,
right? And that, if you don't want to be roughed up by ICE agents on a Sunday afternoon at the park, then you're always free to leave. And if you leave, in fact, they'll even give you $1,000
right.
and they'll allow you to register so that you can apply to enter legally in the future. It's some weird backhanded amnesty. In other
Hmm.
words, like strictly speaking, if you come in illegally, you're not allowed back ever. But they're saying if you self-deport, we'll give you money and we'll give you the
Yeah,
ability to apply to come back.
which they didn't do under Obama, right?
No,
Right,
no, right? So is Trump harsher on immigration or more liberal?
right, exactly,
You know?
exactly.
Um,
Mhm.
so it's like so, but again, if we just think, oh, you're pro-immigration or you're anti-immigration, you're missing the point.
Hmm. Yeah.
That's not it. It never was it. But also, whatever that meant, that rhetoric meant, it no longer means that now.
Hmm. Hmm.
He's also expanding the number of Chinese students
Hmm.
and increasing the number of H-1B visas, but making companies pay $100,000 for an H-1B visa,
Right.
which they will,
Yeah.
which they will. So, is that anti-immigration? Is that pro-immigration? What is that? Right?
It's
So,
a
like these
reform.
three issues, right? Immigration, abortion, the Ukraine war. Is Trump pro-Putin, anti-Putin, pro-Ukraine, anti-Ukraine? Is he pro like Russia alignment, China alignment? What kind of, no. It doesn't fit. And we do have to be careful again to not confuse because the actual actors, the actual politicians, the actual bureaucrats, they know there's a difference between the actual policy and the rhetoric. They do. So we ought to also, right? We can't be caught up in the rhetoric,
Mm, hmm.
right?
Hmm.
We can't be caught up in the rhetoric. Our mutual friend Wyatt, has basically like oscillated, gyrated on the immigration issue based on what Trump has said and did. And it's like,
Yeah.
man, you just can't do that because it just doesn't fit. Like, like you're an anti-immigration person. That's nowhere. Like that
Yeah,
leaves you
that's right.
nowhere, right?
Right.
Leaves you nowhere. Now, I was gonna say in terms of from a socialist perspective,
Mm,
um, that what we have to be paying attention to is the configuration of capitalism that's coming out of all of this, which is not being masterminded, but is going to be muddled through and just assume whatever shape happens to work.
hmm.
More or less deliberately or self-consciously. Meaning it's not like, oh, they adopt this policy, they implement it, and they change capitalism in this way. It never happened that way. It's not going to happen that way. Right. So that's the other thing is that my I've seen my role in this last 10 years as being removing the blinders from being able to see what's actually going on
Yeah.
in the world. I mean, unfortunately, removing the blinders has meant attending to the events of capitalist politics in a way that the danger is to be misled into thinking this is the essential domain of action.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not, and I think that one of the virtues of Trump is that, as much as they want to in a self-serving way, cast him as an extreme Republican, as a far-right person, his entire success is predicated on him precisely not being that.
Yeah.
Right. And again, that can make him seem more sinister.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's why he particularly is the object of criticism from certain Democratic Party centrists of the old line kind of 1990s neoliberal varieties, precisely because they see but can't really admit the nature of the threat. That actually he's the new centrism.
Or the nature of the promise.
Right. That's right.
In
That's
other
right.
words, like all the people who are going down in flames, like your Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger's, or your kind of intellectuals of the dark web, and
Yeah,
who are screaming bloody murder and protesting.
exactly.
It could be that exactly what they want is what Trump is paving the way for.
Yes.
You
Yes.
know, and I think that with the Democrats, obviously they have to just try to use everything against him. And they did that with Reagan. I remember this. I was pretty young, but I remember. Reagan could do nothing right. He was
Mm-hmm.
senile, he was bumbling. The administration was incompetent ideological hacks, and Nancy Reagan was determining policy via astrology, like everything crazy. Like, in other words, they tried to make it into like a non-administration.
And you've pointed out that during Reagan's first term, there was a lot to give credence to this impression. Just from a neutral outside observer, it actually kind of appeared that way to a lot of people.
Chaotic.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they had to try different things. Um, and you know, they weren't acting strictly according to principle. They had certain goals, and they had a notion of an opportunity that needed to be seized. But again, that opportunity that needed to be seized had already manifested and had already been acted upon under Carter
Mm.
already. Cold War II had already begun. Neoliberal economic policies had already begun. And then it was just a matter of, well, of course, we're the oppositional party. We want to compete. We want to get in there, right? And
Mm.
so, we can serve this moment better. And of course, we want to be in power.
Right.
And there is a long-term vision, like being in power means that you can, appoint judges who have lifetime appointments. You can staff the bureaucracy. Reagan made the bureaucracy take a loyalty oath. He purged the bureaucracy via a loyalty oath.
Mm. Mm.
And it ultimately passed muster, meaning it was considered not unconstitutional, not illegal. Although, of course, at the time, everyone was like, this is unconstitutional, this is illegal. Well, it turns out no.
And this incidentally brings to mind precisely what you pointed out before, the kind of the lag, the political lag that the bureaucracy represents, namely the bureaucracy, the people who are staffed in the bureaucracy were placed there by the prior era's bipartisan consensus, and they will represent sort of the lag, the holding on to those policies and that politics in the face of something new.
Yeah, and look, there's no reason to abandon all policies if they seem to be working to any extent. It's
Right.
only when they're fully calamitous that you abandon them. And convincing them that they're fully calamitous is difficult, meaning the war on terror was 20 years.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
somehow people still weren't convinced this is a
Yeah.
calamitous policy. After 20 years, there were people
Yeah.
who were holding out. And again, did Trump represent some deep, principled opposition to that policy? No, he was just like, it ain't working.
Right. Right.
Like, it's like literally like, am I the only one to say it ain't working? How come all you people are glazed over eyes, unwilling to admit that it's not working? It's kind of obvious to anybody it's not working.
Hmm.
Right? And their response was, you don't know what you're talking about. This is what we have to do. There
Yeah.
is no alternative.
Right. Right.
And he's like, surely there must be. Even just a little bit.
Yeah.
There must be something. So, but again, that's the sclerosis that I would emphasize. Because I think
Mm.
that messaging can be changed faster than practices, than
Yeah.
policy practices. Also, we could say, I mentioned like the corporations, the civil social world. Yeah, they change. Do they change more quickly? Do they change more slowly? In some ways, they change more quickly. They're freer to change more quickly, meaning people can move from state to state, they can change jobs, they can do all sorts of things. People can vote with their feet. And corporations can radically change what they do. So on the one hand, they can change more quickly. On the other hand, they also change more slowly, meaning
Right. They're just
people
bureaucratized.
they're bureaucratized, but also think of it this way. You go to school for a career. It's hard to
Yeah.
change track. It's hard
Hmm.
to change
Oh, yeah.
track. Companies make major investments in building facilities or investing in technologies or hiring people.
Yeah.
It's hard to change tracks when you've done that.
We all see this in our own individual lives as sellers of our own labor power.
That's
Yeah.
right.
We've,
So
we've, we've sunk costs and sunk capital in whatever it is that we're doing.
that's right. Absolutely. And so I think that that's where, we're dealing with multiple temporalities. And again, this is the lesson of the Harvey, the condition of postmodernity. Um, and so what does it mean to say that Trump is like a once in a 50-year phenomenon? Well, you could say that a confluence, I think that I cited this in the Fear Itself article. Ray Dalio, he's a sort of investment banker guy. He said that what's unique about the moment now is that it's several different crises rolled into one,
Mm, hmm,
right?
hmm.
And that it's rare for a crisis to be appearing in all these different domains at the same time.
Yeah.
That's what makes Trump a once in a 50-year type of figure. And again, emphasizing once in 50 years, meaning beyond Nixon and Reagan, beyond Clinton and Newt Gingrich. Like all the major changes of my lifetime, this might be bigger than all those,
Hmm. Hmm.
including, collapse of the Soviet Union, opening the WTO to China. All these things might be quite secondary in comparison to the combined crisis and change that we're in the midst of. And Trump, because he's opportunistic, because he doesn't care, he doesn't stand on principle, because he does represent also, I think that I wrote about this in the millennial left was unborn, the presentation I gave at our convention this year, that he represented what he thought was a squandered, unfulfilled potential of Reaganism.
Mm.
And so, interestingly, therefore, he seems to represent the overthrowing of Reaganism, but in his own mind, he's fulfilling it.
Yeah.
He's fulfilling its potential that went unrealized, which means not what it actually was.
He's arguing
Right?
that those
So
who claim that those who claim to inherit it on both in both political parties actually squandered it, actually did not, were not its proper inheritors.
that's right. And so I think that that's the other, like when we think of why Trump was the person, the man in the moment, it's a peculiarity. It's not like, oh, he was totally up to date and willing to think in new ways. No, he was actually thinking the old way, but in this kind of offbeat manner that then helps him bring about something else.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? So that's, he's a peculiar character that way. And, you mentioned hypernormalization. Adam Curtis, as like Trump has some fulfillment of the 70s and 80s, and why that's an unsatisfactory explanation. And I think it's an unsatisfactory explanation because I think that the horror, like when Reagan was elected in 1980, it looked like the victory of Barry Goldwater, like the
Yeah.
long delayed victory of like Joseph McCarthy, 50s Cold War, anti-communism. And
Right.
yet, and so it's going to be World War III. It's going to be, the day after nuclear holocaust. And yet, no, Reagan won the Cold War. He ended the Cold War peacefully. Right? Does that mean that everyone was wrong about Barry Goldwater all along? Probably. But also, that's not the point. The point is that Reagan, as a Cold Warrior, as a Barry Goldwater type Republican against the Rockefeller Republicans, against the realist Nixon and Kissinger, turned out to be the viable alternative rather than the crazed ideologue. So he started out as like, the crusading Cold Warrior, anti-communist. He ended up being the pragmatic, non-ideological, and in and through taking a hard line with the Soviet Union.
Hmm.
Right? So again, it's weird because the immigration issue, it was not the same kind of issue in the 80s that it became later.
Right.
So people will say, well, the Reagan amnesty on immigration, that you don't want a repeat of that. And that's like the old Republican Party. That's the old open borders Republican Party. Actually, it really wasn't. That wasn't really Reagan's position. And Trump didn't have a strong position on that at the time.
Right. It, it
Or
wasn't it wasn't quite the same scale of an issue at that time as well, right?
it was a big issue. It was a big enough issue. I mean, the Biden era has changed it, and the collapse of Latin American economies has changed it. And the general collapse of global, third world economies in the recession and COVID eras have changed it a little bit.
Yeah.
But there was already serious immigrant labor dependency that developed in the 80s. There
Okay.
already was. Right. But it's not like, okay, well, it's not like Reagan, the unfulfilled potential of Reagan was like stopping immigration or something. Like that's not what Trump represents. No, he
Yeah.
represents like actually the peace dividend and that kind of
Mm-hmm.
idea.
Mm-hmm.
And also, multilateral versus like unilateral or trilateral trade negotiating.
Hmm.
Right. So he thought that basically the George Herbert Walker Bush, part of the squandering of the end of the Cold War and opening up of the global economy was that it wasn't negotiated well.
Hmm. I
Meaning
see.
that you were just sort of, opening it up pell-mell rather than very strategically to make sure that the US was always taking advantage of the opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
Where instead he thinks that there was just a complacency,
Hmm.
that things would work out for the best, but meanwhile the world took over, took advantage of the United States, and that was also something that went back to the Nixon and Reagan era. So if you think about the dropping of the dollar standard, the gold standard, and letting the dollar float, and then the Plaza Accords of Reagan, in both instances, what it amounted to was the post-World War II situation. It deliberately set it up to advantage the other countries and disadvantage the US in order to build up those other countries. But that was
Yes.
done at the end of the 60s. And so it was time to end that system. And yet they didn't fully do that. And then it became an even worse problem with the rise of China after the end of the Cold War.
So this relates to something I've been considering recently, and that you tipped me off to, Yanis Varoufakis and the global minotaur thesis.
Yes, yes.
Um, how does that figure here?
Well, he's looking at it the other way. So Varoufakis is looking at it as the willingness of the rest of the world to prop up the US. So not the willingness of the US to be taken advantage of by the rest of the world, but rather the
Hmm.
willingness of the rest of the world to prop up the US. and how the
In
rest of the world has become dependent on propping up the US.
in the sense that capital accumulated in other countries is reinvested through U.S. finance and or in U.S. real estate.
That's right.
Yeah,
And so, I would say that Varoufakis is kind of ambivalent on this, which is to say that he thinks that there is something structural about it, that of course this is what they're going to do, on the one hand. On the other hand, that it is in their best interest to do this. On the other hand, he also thinks that um, that it's the wrong thing to do. Right. And and that it creates a situation where, the US can assert more power. So he's, thinking of it as like a policy constraint. And also he's thinking of it, he is some kind of a socialist. He is some kind of a Marxist.
right.
So he is thinking of it in terms of, and he taught in the United States. He taught at the University of Texas in Austin.
Hmm.
And so, he's lived in the United States. And so he's thinking of it, Varoufakis does not think that the US is going to lead the world to socialism. He doesn't think there's going to be a proletarian socialist revolution in America that's going to lead the world to socialism. He doesn't. He's a European leftist like that.
Right. And in his positive prescription, or at least retrospective prescription, he's a Keynesian. He argues that I think he argues that at the end of the Second World War, they should have adopted some alternative system for like a global monetary standard other than the dollar. That with the dollar as the world's reserve currency creates these certain problems that the creation of like a new sort of nation state neutral reserve currency would have avoided. So that's sort of his,
That's
with
right.
socialism off the table, that's his like proposed solution.
That's one solution. And he also, once that got underway, you can't really undo it. And that's why he's been quick to say that China's currency will not replace the US's currency. It can't replace it. But what it can do is serve as a kind of risk buffer for the dollar. And that's why the US isn't even really against it.
Yeah.
Right. So, um, that's, now I think that that's based on a situation that's really pre global recession and pre COVID for sure, because it is based on a perspective that he had already before the Greek sovereign debt crisis.
Hmm.
Right? This is a kind of long-term thesis that he has, a long-term perspective that he has, analysis that he has. Um,
Right.
and it could be that things are changing in such a way as to render it irrelevant. In other words, whatever critical purchase it had, including whatever like despair or fatalism it exhibited, well, it might not be relevant anymore. And I think what he's advocating now is that China and Europe should get together to oppose the US. And I addressed that in my Fear Itself article. I said that that really can't happen because they feel more threatened by each other than either feels threatened by the US.
Hmm. Hmm. So that's
And that,
certainly a different reading from Trump. Like they both have discontents with the kind of neoliberal era NAFTA type regime, but the discontents are different. They're pointing in different directions
oh, very
politically.
different. Yeah, I would say that Trump, first of all, Trump's not an anti-neoliberal. What it means is, and people have said he's not an anti-neoliberal, like Vivek Chibber, DSA Jacobin, Catalyst magazine, that they've tried to say Trump's a hyper neoliberal. Well, so some people think they misapprehend Trump as anti-neoliberal. Some misapprehend him as hyper neoliberal or ultra neoliberal. I'm not sure what the difference there would be, but hyper neoliberal means like, I guess, neoliberal squared as opposed to just more neoliberalism.
Hmm.
It's like compounded neoliberalism or something. Post neoliberalism is the challenge,
Hmm.
because why I've chosen that is because I wanted to challenge our notion of neoliberalism to begin with. Right. So it's not like, okay, we have this thing, neoliberalism, we know what it is, and it's going to continue in some ways and change in other ways. No, we have to think more radically about it. Meaning, what has neoliberalism proven to be in retrospect now in its crisis? meaning maybe they thought they were doing one thing, and it turns out to have resulted in this other situation entirely. And that's where we get, like the Hassan Piker interview with Ross Douthat, post-liberal. And what does that even mean? So, they talked about it in terms of democracy versus like monarchism, Curtis Yarvin. But another way of looking at it, of course, is globalism and nationalism. So, does post-liberal mean nationalist? Does it mean collectivist? Does it mean authoritarian? Right? Is that what that means? Maybe not. Right?
Right.
So that's what post-liberal suggests, but that sounds more like anti-liberal or illiberal. Post-liberal, it's a bad term because really we're not talking about liberal, we're talking about neoliberal.
Right.
And
Exactly.
why that's important is that post-liberal could sound post-progressive, meaning, okay, there's one kind of post-liberal, a conservative reaction to Obama Biden progressivism. Another kind of post-liberal would be socialism. So, meaning the center doesn't hold, and so you can either depart from it to the right or to the left.
Hmm. Hmm.
But no, what Hassan Piker means by socialism is not, is not that. It's not that. In other words, Hassan Piker, I'm sure, thinks of himself as the anti-Ezra Klein, but maybe it is just a variety of the Ezra Klein.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
Right. So, in other words, that these are shadows of Trump, and that's where this clarity of post-neoliberal comes in, because there are things that they don't really want to get rid of. I mean, I think the part of the Ross Douthat, Hassan Piker, the longer conversation that they had, did have to do with freedom of speech on the internet and censorship, right? And basically, both agreed. They agreed. Well, of course, a certain amount of censorship is required, right? So it was already no longer, well, neither party is the free speech party, and let's complain about that. And Trump pretended to be a free speech advocate, but it turns out he wasn't, right? It's
Yeah.
already beyond that. Like, we're already
Yeah.
just 9 months in, we're already beyond like one party stands for censorship, the other party stands for free speech. Rather, everyone can agree that a certain amount of censorship is required. And so the question is, what kind?
Yeah.
Right? And what are the consequences? Maybe being suspended rather than being completely booted from a platform, being temporarily suspended. Maybe not losing your job, but getting some kind of reprimand, right? This
Hmm.
kind of thing. So, and that's how they were thinking of it as post-liberal. It's kind
Right.
of like
This
not
makes me
let's
nostalgic for neoliberalism, nostalgic for the civil libertarian liberals of the neoliberal era, for the
yeah.
Nadine Strawson sort of perspective that's quite a dying breed politically.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
Well, because it's just not going to be as simple as that. It's not
Hmm.
going to be, you know, uh, censorship, no censorship, and state censorship versus private censorship. It's not going to work out like that. Now, I might have whatever preferences I have.
Sure.
The question is, what is it going to be?
Yeah.
Where is it
Yeah. Yeah.
headed? And it's probably headed in a direction where, again, from a socialist perspective, one is not happy with the alternatives, nor is one happy with the implicit or explicit consensus
Of
that's
course.
emerging. Right. So I think that in that respect, again, the third way, there
Hmm.
are two kinds of third ways. There's the reconfigured capitalist center third way, and then there's the way that socialism has to be a third way,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
a completely different sense. Not formulating a new bipartisan consensus, but actually formulating a meaningful opposition to that bipartisan consensus that isn't just about opposing it from the left or from the right in capitalist political terms, meaning in progressive or conservative terms.
That's right. So before this parrot room discussion, I sort of teased the audience that I would ask you a question about your intellectual biography, and
Oh
I
yeah.
think this brings us around to it. I also teased the idea that we would talk about organized crime
Oh
and its
yeah.
historical specificity in the kind of high New Deal Keynesian Fordist era. And maybe we can come around to that another time. That would maybe be good, a good discussion in and of itself. Um, but but I guess the question I have for you, in light of what you just said about the socialist third way, as opposed to the realigned post-neoliberal capitalist third way, um, I guess, like, thinking about these themes, as you know, and maybe some in our audience will know, I've done some research and thinking on the old Socialist Party of America during the time of Eugene Debs, and then obviously, as evidenced by this Compact magazine piece that I recently published, I've also been thinking a little bit about neoliberalism, post-neoliberalism, realignment, and capitalist politics. And from, let's say, just from an academic point of view, like the academic left and the wider, like the academic adjunct of the Democratic Party, right? Like the disciplines, political science, history. These would seem to be totally sort of self-enclosed and unrelated topics. Now, interestingly, if you're pursuing them, in whether in the discipline of history or political science, it is true, as we talked about during our previous recording, that basically all of the scholarship is sort of oriented to the,
Progressivism. Yeah.
yes, Democratic Party, progressivism, the New Deal, um, in both topics, right? Like whether you're researching like Debsian socialism or capitalist political realignment, almost everyone you're reading is in some way oriented to the New Deal and capitalist progressivism. Why the old Socialist Party should have been that but wasn't, or anticipated that, or was only good insofar as it was aligned with one constituency, like the Wobblies and industrial syndicalism that eventually fed into that, right? So the New Deal dominates that literature, and then of course the New Deal dominates the literature on realignment as well. I'm thinking of I'm not super familiar with his work, but the historian Gary Gersel, I think
Oh
Ezra
yeah.
Klein read him,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and there are many others like Thomas Frank and
Right.
right, Rick Perlstein. So these seem totally disconnected, um, and 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 what occurs to me is that even though you've probably been thinking about them for decades, it seems to me, when I look at your work, like roughly between the years 2014 and 2018, you got really serious about thinking and writing about both
Mm.
simultaneously, and they would seem to pull in different directions, and yet they seem somehow related. And I guess I'm maybe searching for a question here, but like, how do you understand? Maybe it's just an elaboration on what you've already said, but like, how do you understand the motivations of your own thinking behind these two topics, considering that they're like they're normally treated as quite separate? I think you bring it together in
Well,
your age piece, but
the end of the Gilded Age piece. Yeah. So, I think that because the millennial left resolved itself into the DSA, and with Jacobin magazine in particular. So even before Bernie, I think I was starting to think in this direction
mhm,
that Harringtonian democratic socialism and its Shachtmanite roots, and the Shachtman realignment idea from the 60s, and how I've maintained that it was misconstrued by later generations. Um, that it wasn't about realigning the Democratic Party into a socialist party, but it was about creating the space for a socialist party
mhm,
by overcoming what was seen as stymieing it, meaning that there wasn't a clean progressive conservative split between the two parties, between the Republicans and the Democrats, and why the civil rights movement was so important for Shachtman in the 50s, because the civil rights movement did demonstrate the fact that the two parties did not represent conservative versus progressive capitalist politics. the Republicans every year would put up anti-lynching legislation, civil rights legislation, and they would be voted down all the time by the Democrats, the Dixiecrats. And that was only changed with LBJ.
And if I could interject, so this actually gets to what we talked about in our last recording, which I told you off the recording, I thought was a kind of climax of the conversation we had some hours ago, which is the notion that what constituted the particular political power and force of the New Deal Democratic Party was that it was able to combine both capitalist progressivism and a kind of conservative
Southern
populism.
conservatism, yeah.
So the idea, so from a socialist perspective, you would actually not want that. You would want to configure capitalist politics in such a way that those forces would not be combined within a single party.
I mean, look, what I want, I don't know. Let me be clear about that. But I was taking the authenticity of the millennial turn into Harringtonian DSA, democratic socialism, and Shachtmanism in that respect seriously. Right. So we were not alone, for instance, in disinterring Bayard Rustin from the crypt of history. We were not alone in that. Right.
Right? No, that's the centerpiece for Jacobin DSA.
It is. I mean, we did have that from the very beginning, meaning before Jacobin. But I
Yeah.
think John D'Amelio was already working on and publishing his biography of Bayard Rustin.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And
Right,
he's
right.
longstanding DSA. Yeah.
That's right. So I was guided by that and looking at the authenticity of it, but also the authenticity of the misconstrual of the history and the deliberate confusion about it. Deliberate meaning they couldn't afford to be clear to themselves about the fact that they didn't want to be part of the Democratic Party. Because in fact, the original DSA of Harrington, 1982 DSA, does not have a realignment orientation at all. It's the Shachtmanites of the 50s and 60s and into the 70s that has the realignment orientation, not the DSA. In other words, when Harrington started the DSA, that was the signal that he had abandoned the realignment strategy because he was just parking in the Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He was liquidating. He was abandoning. And he said it's a remnant of a remnant. Right? And so what does that mean? It means a remnant of the Shachtmanites, which were themselves a remnant of the old SPA. So Jacobin DSA reached back to a pre-DSA Harringtonianism, the realignment strategy of the 60s. But what they were really trying to reach back to was the Debsian Socialist Party, whether they knew it or not. And actually, they did know it, but it was in the form of Kautskyism and was Lenin a Kautskyist. There was very little about Debs other than sentimentally. There was very little actual investigation into the old Debsian Socialist Party. Now, Jack Ross did, but he's an offbeat guy. He's an offbeat guy who at first also had like a conservative audience.
Yes.
Right? And so he was very much not DSA. He was very much not the Jacobin attitude. And also he himself is hostile to Harringtonianism.
Right. If anything, he's probably dispositionally closer to the old Social Democrats USA in certain respects,
In
but
certain
no.
respects, although he's also very anti-Shachtman.
Right. Right.
Right? Um, he's against all the Leninists and all the Trotskyists.
Right.
And so of course
Right.
he's against Shachtman as a Trotskyist. So what that freed him to do, Jack Ross, was actually take a fresh look at the Socialist Party of America that seemed to be motivated by the DSA moment and yet was not taken up by Jacobin DSA. Right? So
Mm-hmm.
I had all these things in mind. I'm like, okay, how is this history bubbling up, being remembered? What's authentic about all of it, including the deliberate avoidance and sort of willful confusion?
Mm-hmm.
What is that speaking to? And, so Shachtman, by contrast, was very clear. He was trying to restore the situation of the old SPA, where the Republicans were the progressives and Democrats were the conservatives, and the Socialist Party was neither.
So what in Shachtman's view would have rendered the Republicans progressive and the Democrats conservative, like especially vis-a-vis the civil rights movement? What would have had
He saw it the other way. In other words, Shachtman saw the New Deal coalition as scrambling capitalist politics in order to exclude socialist politics as a possibility, precisely
Mhm.
because it wasn't a delineation of conservative and progressive. So,
Because it united them.
and well, it what it did is also flipped. So basically, what he wanted to do was he wanted the Democrats to complete the flip from going from the conservative party to the progressive party.
I see.
And casting like so he had an intentional policy that actually came out. Shachtman's realignment strategy was fulfilled. He wanted to push the Dixiecrats out of the Democratic Party into the Republican Party.
Yeah.
And he wanted the black middle class, progressives, to be Democrats.
Hmm. Hmm.
Until the 60s, they were not. They were Republicans.
Right.
Right. And also there was the Southern blacks and there was the Northern blacks. So the Northern blacks had been partially integrated in the New Deal era into an ethnic constituency of the Democratic Party, but not entirely. So he wanted to complete all these processes,
Hmm. Hmm.
which would have meant completing the flip between which party was progressive and which party was conservative. And just to be clear to the audience, before FDR, the Republicans were the progressives and the Democrats were the conservatives, very
Right.
clearly. Woodrow Wilson notwithstanding, because Woodrow Wilson was the first Democratic Party president after the Civil War, besides who am I forgetting? The other non-contiguous two-term president.
Was it Cleveland?
Grover
No.
Cleveland, maybe. Yeah, maybe. So there was
I don't
one Democratic Party president between Abraham Lincoln and Woodrow Wilson.
know. Hmm.
That's
Hmm.
it. One. I mean, you could say Andrew Johnson, who took over after Lincoln's assassination, right? Because he was a Democrat. But really, no. So what did Woodrow Wilson do? He implemented a very right-wing policy. He segregated DC. He segregated the military. That had not happened,
Hmm.
right? So, clearly the Democrats were the conservative party and the Republicans were the progressive party. And they were riding on the coattails of, the Civil War, and it was wearing thin, and there was a need for renewal, and that's why Teddy Roosevelt tried to do what he tried to do.
Hmm.
And as it turned out, the opportunity for change came on the Democratic Party side, and that's what FDR took advantage of, but it was an incomplete process, and it coincided with the crisis of socialism, meaning in Shachtman's view. In Shachtman's view, the crisis of Marxism, the crisis of socialism happened in the 30s.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
And the fact that that happened at the same time that you had the scrambling of capitalist politics was, to his mind, not accidental, and they were tied. In other words, the renewal of socialism was tied to unscrambling capitalist politics. That's what the realignment strategy is about.
Hmm. Hmm.
Because he looked back and he said Debs was able to navigate this.
Yeah. Yeah.
The Debsian Socialist Party arose at the moment that it did as an alternative to the populist movement and in the face of rising progressivism,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? Because it's not that progressivism arose against socialism. In some ways, you could say the Socialist Party of America was formed to meet the challenge presented by the rise of progressivism. Progressivism predates the formal founding of the SPA,
Right. Right.
right? So Shachtman looked back at that and he said, how do we rebuild? Because, I will say, I identify with Shachtman here. I think that he was misled in certain ways, but nonetheless, this essential point, he was looking at things from the standpoint of, I want to restart a socialist party. What would be the optimal conditions for doing so?
Hmm. Hmm.
And there is this workers' movement, but it's compromised by Stalinism, and it's compromised by the New Deal coalition, and it's compromised by a certain independence from direct party affiliation. But still, when the unions are aligned with the Republicans, it's part of this confusion about which party is progressive and which party is conservative. And so if you want to build a working class movement, if you want to build a socialist party, if you want to revitalize the labor movement, because his lieutenants were in the labor movement, A. Philip Randolph,
Yeah,
how do you do this? And also, how do you get the black middle class question out of the way so that the black working class question can come to the fore?
I
Right? So
see.
you have to get civil rights legislation through. You do have to do that in order to separate the interests of the black working class from the black middle class, rather than them being unified spuriously by segregation. Shachtman, he wrote in the 30s about, communism and the Negro, right? So Shachtman was always keen to have the black working class be a force for socialism, but that couldn't happen as long as formal segregation united the middle class and the working class blacks. You had to fulfill the middle class aspirations in order to then have the conflict between the black working class and the black middle class come to the fore.
Yeah,
The force for socialism. Like this
right.
is the realignment strategy.
And at the risk of drawing a through line where there isn't one, it's Trumpian in the sense of wanting capitalist politics to be well negotiated, like for unnecessary,
Clearly negotiated. Right.
yeah, clearly negotiated, like unnecessary noise to be put to rest, so that the field can be seen more clearly and openly.
And so people can openly, assert their interests rather than flying under false flags.
Hmm. Hmm.
Right.
Yeah,
Now, of course, the difference is that capitalist politics can be demagogical, rhetorical, opportunistic, purely tactical, and can negotiate real stakes on a completely unprincipled basis in a way that socialist politics can't.
hmm, hmm,
Right? Socialist politics, by necessity, has to be more principled. It has no other basis than itself. It can't rely on existing social power the way capitalist politics can. Right. So
right.
it can't be a politics of pure tactics the way capitalist politics can be. So it's not like a socialist movement can do what Trump did. No.
No,
However, in this environment, if capitalist politics are shifting, for whatever window, does that open the space for the reconstitution of a socialist movement? That's the way I'm
right.
looking at it, right? And in a way, you have to treat every situation like that, but especially this once in 50 years situation, meaning once in my lifetime, once in you guys' lifetime.
Yeah,
Check it
yeah,
out, right? Like, we're different in age, but not that different. It's once in my lifetime, I'm a little too old for it. It's once in your lifetime, you guys were not too old for it, now you are. And the Zoomers might be too young for it.
right, right.
So that's the question, right? So, but nonetheless, we have to try. And even if we try and fail, we have to leave a legacy of like, remember when people tried that, when people saw it that way, when people
Yeah,
could see the opportunity and not
and
just be like, oh, a disaster, Trump, fascism, ah.
yes, and so a question I have, and I feel like maybe you just sort of answered it, is what went wrong? If the Shachtmanite realignment succeeded in a certain way, what went wrong? And perhaps the answer is no one actually sought to refound
The
a
Socialist Party.
proletarian
That
socialist
is
party.
the answer. In
Yeah,
other words, the opportunity that Shachtman saw in the 50s came true more in the 70s, and it was too late. Right? In other
yeah,
words, that moment had passed, meaning what was a potential for a socialist movement instead became an opportunity for capitalist politics. And that's very
yeah.
similar to this, meaning
Mhm.
whatever opportunity the millennial left had with the war on terror and the Great Recession, 10 years later, taken advantage of by Trump, meaning too late. And the millennials figured it out. That's why they got on board with Bernie,
Right.
because they're like, yeah, we missed our chance, but we still have this thing that we can do, you know? And also I've pointed this out, which is that the millennials were always very confused over what they really wanted. Did they really want a new socialist movement, or did they just want a progressive reform of capitalism? And Bernie embodied that ambiguity.
That's right. That's right. And coming back around to it, it'll be clear to you, it may not have been clear to the audience, that I certainly share your critical perspective of Chris Hedges, whom I raised at the beginning. Um, Completely, there are probably 10 different critiques you could mount, right, from an orthodox Marxist perspective. But from that same perspective, you would see a figure like him as symptomatic, right, of like a kind of like populist progressivism. And what struck me, I was sort of in that milieu actually, circa
Sure,
2010.
sure.
I was in that milieu, that kind of Robert McChesney, reading the Baffler and Thomas Frank, like that kind of populist progressive, third party adjacent. If only the Democrats could still be like the New Deal and the Great Society, and they betray progressivism and they've Reaganized and corporatized, like the whole thing. I was in that milieu, but there is like there's such patent discontent, and like he even Chris Hedges cites Walter Rauschenbusch and like sees him as a model, the social gospel. And what comes to mind is for me is that of course the social gospel, and I believe Rauschenbusch himself, circa the 1890s roughly, I think, was of course aligned with capitalist progressivism. But there were others like George Herron, whom I've researched, and some other figures around the Socialist Party of America, who actually took that in an independent socialist party political direction.
Direction. Yeah.
And so, so I look at Chris Hedges and, I sort of think, well, these kinds of discontents and this kind of milieu, Jack Ross points to this as well. In under political conditions in which there would be a socialist party, an emergent socialist party, a socialist party could kind of interface and operate with these discontents, these kind of populist, progressive, petit bourgeois discontents. But
Yeah.
but inevitably, there's
Would
nothing.
have to transcend it. Yeah.
Yeah, you'd have to transcend it, but it at least expresses something like some kind of frustration, some kind of alienation, a lack of political integration.
Well, this is where socialist intellectuals come from.
Right.
And they are a necessary ingredient, but an insufficient ingredient. And so, like I said, with Shachtman and the realignment strategy in the 50s and 60s, he had a working class movement that was also ripe for the picking, meaning for socialist leadership. And so it
Mm.
is significant that the UAW, which had been a militant union in the 30s, where there had been some Trotskyist influence, was, therefore familiar to Shachtman in that respect. Walter Reuter, that they were the bankrollers of both the civil rights movement and the SDS,
Right. Right.
right? And which was shepherded in by Harrington's League for Industrial Democracy, which was again a kind of halfway house between the Socialist Party under Shachtmanite leadership and the labor movement.
Hmm.
Right? It was a reform current in organized labor.
Yeah.
And so, in terms of like what went wrong, right? Um, it's complicated, meaning I'm not sure that Shachtman's strategy could have ever worked. However, what I do know is that the millennials recalling it was a strange optical illusion transposition, because in some ways it had to do with the fact that they wanted it to be the 60s that never was. In other words, um, they wanted civil rights movement without the Black Power turn.
Hmm.
They wanted great society without the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
And maybe that was never to be. And that does point to a weakness of Shachtmanism, because after all, Shachtman also wanted those things. Meaning
Mm.
Shachtman is seen as someone who conceded too much to the Vietnam War. He conceded to the Vietnam War. He didn't want it.
He saw it as the kind of political price of admission.
I wouldn't even say that. I
Hmm.
would say that So it's not Shachtman's position and Bayard Rustin's position actually is not the part of the way with LBJ. That's more the Southern Black Democrats. That's not even the MLK position, really. Right?
Hmm.
That's what it becomes in hindsight, but that's not what it was. Like that's not the Bayard Rustin, A. Philip Randolph, MLK position. Part of the way with LBJ. No. They're
Hmm.
much more Mississippi Freedom Democrat,
Hmm.
which
Hmm.
when it looks like it's not going to work, then Bayard Rustin is like, yeah, we need to concede. But that's not a part of the way with LBJ. And it's also not this idea of like, we'll support the Great Society, and the price of that is to go along with Vietnam, but actually we're going to try to turn the tables. And because LBJ needs us on the Great Society, we will oppose the Vietnam War and he'll be forced to abandon the Vietnam War because he wants our support on the Great Society. Right. Again, the late New Left has a whole other explanation for this that isn't really accurate to the dynamics of the time or the possibilities of the time. So
Hmm.
I'm not sure that this Shachtman strategy could have worked. A, B, um, or that I would have wanted it to work, that would have really been the path for a refounded socialist party coming out of the 60s New Left. Because the 60s New Left, on the other hand, also represented something new. So what failed in the 60s was not only the old, but also
Yeah.
the new
Yeah.
possibilities. And that's where, I remain a student of both Adolf Fried and Moise Postone in the sense that they also represented the potential for something new,
Hmm.
not just the
Hmm.
fulfillment of the old. Not the fulfillment of the 30s. And insofar as the millennials reached back to both the 60s and the 30s, they also reached back to the earlier period. They also reached back to Debsian socialism. And in a way that, the 30s did, that generation did, the 60s generation did. But I thought maybe the millennials are doing it more authentically. Why? Because I saw both the New Deal and the Great Society exhausted in the millennials moment.
Yeah.
Right? Which is, of course, the case. And I think the misleading character of like Trumpian republicanism is that there have been people who've gotten on board with Trump who have thought, now's our chance to undo the Great Society. Now's our chance to undo the New Deal. And that's never what he represented.
Right.
So, what does it indicate? It indicates that there actually is a crisis of what? The Democratic Party that's shaped by the New Deal and the Great Society. The New Deal coalition is modified by the Great Society coalition,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? But the real object for me is the earlier history. In other words, what's left out of all of that. But what was actively sidelined by both the New Deal and the Great Society. And of course, by neoliberalism. Again, if we look at neoliberalism the way we were looking at it, not as the negation of the New Deal and the Great Society, but as in furtherance of those two things.
Optimization under new
Yeah.
conditions.
And
Yeah.
so that's where I felt like there was an authentic millennial moment that reached back all the way back to not just a tweaking of the New Deal and the Great Society, and not some kind of spurious like anti-New Deal or anti-Great Society, because that's just not going to happen.
And I have to say, I conceptually understand what you're saying, but being maybe part of the millennial left, I find it very difficult to find evidence of what you just said. So when you say that there was this millennial moment, this authentic reaching back, neoliberalism combines the New Deal and the Great Society. It's coming into crisis. The millennial moment gives rise to this authentic reaching back before the whole thing.
Reconsidering the whole 20th century.
Where do you see that in the millennial moment in the millennial left?
Oh, the neo-Kautskyism.
Okay. Okay.
Neo-Kautskyism. Definitely. Like the fact that they did recall Debs in a more straightforward way, but again, hidden behind this mask of Kautsky, but still that was something,
Yeah.
right? That was still something. And I thought, okay, what would fulfilling that really mean? Because it would open up all these questions again, because I knew that this history would be unfamiliar. It wouldn't fit. But they recoiled. Look, Bhaskar Sankara went for Miliband, right? Where he's just like, well, of course we love our Debs and we love our Lenin and we love our Rosa Luxemburg and we even like Trotsky sometimes. but we just don't live in that world anymore, so it's got to be Ralph Miliband. And it's like, fuck, man, what are you talking about? Like, shit, you know?
Right,
And
because you can't have a party without a movement, and the movement has to be the labor movement, and the movement is in and around the Democratic Party, and therefore, yeah, this has always been the logic for 100 years. Yeah.
yeah, this has been the logic, and we need something else. And I thought that for a moment they understood that too, but they recoiled. And it's understandable because it's a big task that we have.
Well, right, and I suspect, and I used to have the historical receipts to bear out this point. I'm not sure I still do, but it's tricky because the New Left had its own quasi neo-Kautskian
It
moment,
did.
but that was also filtered through certain
The 30s.
sort of. My understanding is it was through, right. It was filtered through the politics of the 30s in which Stalin comes warped through the New Deal Great Society.
That's right. So Stalinism really colored it too much. Um, Now, and again, I will also say mostly my thought has been disciplined by platypus and therefore the intellectual aspect and the ideological aspect. So what we're talking about now is what I thought this reconsideration of history at an ideological and also at an intellectual, more theoretically substantive level amounted to. Now that leaves aside the whole question of practical politics. And I
Mhm.
think that that's where, again, I'm keenly aware of the non-identity of theory and practice, the separation of these kinds of tasks. And so, I just, because I've written a response to Benjamin Studebaker on ideology critique, I have him in mind. And so he's like, look, we're just not returning to the social conditions of the 19th century. I know, I know, right? So that's where it's maximum flexibility at the level of civil social organizing and the experimental exploratory
Right.
approach and training ourselves at a very basic level to be organizers and activists and just to see, right?
Mhm.
There is not a script. Um, and so obviously it's not a matter of like taking the theory of Kautsky Marxism and implementing it in practice. It just isn't that. However, I did consider that historical memory to be a significant ideological phenomenon that indicated something. And again, an actual deep dive into that history reveals a whole social world that isn't the same as ours. And yet, when we see what they were able to do, we might be inspired to try some similar things now.
Right. And the only two categories aren't theory and practice. There's also the category of a model, which is a little bit different from a theory.
Yes, I think that's entirely true. So we don't exactly have a model, but what we have is a kind of what we talked about in platypus, a present absence. In other
Hmm.
words, the shape, we don't have like a model, like a mold to just refill. We have something
Yeah.
bigger than that. We have an empty space,
Yeah.
the contours of which suggest something. And it
Yes.
sort of corresponds to the old model, but it's not the same.
And this is sort of I think the most profound point that Jack Ross makes in his history of the
Yep.
Socialist Party of America, that
Yeah.
all not only US but ultimately global history and politics of the past century is conditioned by the absence of something.
The absence of that old socialist party and the kind of social space that it
Yeah.
occupied,
Yeah.
primarily because that it didn't occupy a political space. In fact, it was defined by not occupying a political space. When
Yeah.
that social democracy did come to occupy a political space, it was something different, and it actually
Hmm.
ended up occupying a different social space.
Hmm.
And that's where we get the Burnhamism, right? Because it's clear that the social space occupied by the socialist and communist parties in the 20th century was very different than the social space that they occupied in the late 19th and early 20th century.
Right.
Meaning
It becomes elite circulation, but it
it
actually
becomes
doesn't.
elite circulation, but it didn't start out that way.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
after all, that's not some profound thing like, oh, the Socialist Party becomes part of elite circulation. Everything becomes part of elite circulation.
Yes.
You could say that
Yes.
about the church. You could say that about anything,
Right.
right?
Of
And so
course.
it's not unique to the Socialist Party that it succumbs to being merely elite circulation. It
Right.
does, but only as a function of its failure.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, and Lenin and others were savvy enough at the time
Aware.
to know that was a risk, that in
That's a
failure
possibility.
it would devolve into nothing more than that. Yeah.
That's right. And so, we can't be afraid of that.
Right.
We have to serve the possibility of something else, which is no guarantee.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so, at worst, it becomes part of elite circulation. And of course, there
Right.
can be crazy versions of that. Fascism. Like,
Yes.
speaking of Italian elite theory, there are crazy versions of that Mussolini. But I'm confident that the United States is not turn of the century Italy.
Right.
Turn of
Indeed.
the century Italy is pretty backward. It's a Mediterranean country. We'll talk about this some other time. It's mafia ridden. You
Yes.
know,
Yes.
I mean, as soon as I said that, I'm like, oh, maybe it is like the United States. No, 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 no. It's semi-feudal. It's semi-feudal. I'll bring in Gramsci, the Southern question. It's
Right.
semi-feudal. The United States ain't that. No.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Cool.
Well, thanks, Chris. This has been great. Great
Yeah,
discussion. And we'll see. I don't want to tease the audience too much, but it's possible that, and I'll give you a report and an update. But it's possible that our podcasting team, for this new podcast on the history and legacy of Debsian socialism, might be coming together. And so I think this episode was a
excellent.
great prelude for that.
Hermeneutic.
Our
Yeah,
team members,
excellent.
others thinking about the big picture questions. So
Cool. No, glad to help in that regard. All right. So till next time.
till next time.